March 4, 1944, 28,000 feet above Brandenburg, Germany. Oberleutnant Kurt Bonger tightened his oxygen mask as his Messerschmitt Bee Eff 109 screamed through thin stratospheric air. Another American bombing raid, another desperate interception mission. But this morning, scanning the sky for the familiar silhouettes of Republic P-47s and Lockheed P-38s that always turned back somewhere over the Dutch border, he saw something that made his blood freeze. Silver fighters, sleek and unfamiliar, were still escorting the bomber formation deep over German territory. Impossibly deep. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Bonger knew every Allied fighter's operational radius by heart. The math was simple, brutal, and until today, reliable. The P-47 Thunderbolt could reach maybe Hannover before fuel forced it to turn back. The P-38 Lightning might stretch to Kassel if conditions were perfect. But Berlin, 600 kilm from the English coast? That distance required fuel capacity no single-engine fighter possessed. The laws of physics, the limitations of internal combustion, the tyranny of range over weight ratios, all made long-range fighter escort to the Reich capital impossible. German High Command had built their entire defensive strategy on this mathematical certainty. Yet here, circling protectively above the American Boeing B-17 flying fortresses, were single-engine fighters, bearing the white star of the United States Army Air Forces. They moved with predatory grace, weaving patterns that kept them between the bombers and every German fighter that approached. When Bonger's flight leader ordered the attack, diving toward the bomber formation from 29,000 feet, 4 of the unknown American fighters rolled inverted and dove after them with shocking acceleration. The subsequent dogfight lasted 17 minutes. Bonger survived. 3 of his squadron mates did not. The American fighters, later identified through frantic radio traffic as North American P-51 Mustangs, demonstrated performance that exceeded German intelligence assessments by orders of magnitude. They were faster than the Bf 109 above 20,000 feet. They rolled better. They turned competitively. And most devastating of all, they were here, over Berlin, with enough fuel remaining to fight aggressively before escorting the bombers all the way back to England. Landing at his base near Magdeburg with fuel gauges reading nearly empty and his engine temperature in the red zone from extended combat power, Bonger filed a combat report that would be read with growing horror by Luftwaffe command. Single-engine enemy fighters engaged over Berlin, superior high-altitude performance, extended operational range previously considered impossible, multiple friendly aircraft lost. Similar reports flooded Luftwaffe headquarters throughout that day as over 800 American bombers, escorted by more than 900 fighters, struck Berlin in the first major daylight raid on the capital. The P-51 Mustang had arrived in force, and with its arrival, the mathematical foundation of German air defense strategy collapsed entirely. What German commanders did not yet understand was that this single aircraft represented not just technological innovation, but a fundamental shift in the character of American industrial warfare. The Mustang embodied solutions to problems Germany knew existed, but lacked the resources, the industrial philosophy, and the strategic vision to solve. The aircraft flying over Berlin that March morning was the product of Anglo-American collaboration, mass production techniques that prioritized operability over perfection, and a strategic bombing doctrine that committed unlimited industrial resources to a single objective: destroying the Luftwaffe's capacity to defend German airspace. The revelation would be crushing. Not because the Mustang was an invincible superfighter, it wasn't, but because it was good enough, produced in overwhelming numbers, and fielded with tactical doctrine that exploited every advantage while negating German defensive strategy. The interrogation of captured American pilots who had flown Mustangs provided German intelligence officers with technical details that seemed almost fantastical. The North American aviation P-51 utilized a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that gave the British Supermarine Spitfire its legendary high-altitude performance. But unlike the Spitfire, which traded endurance for agility, the Mustang married that powerful engine to an airframe designed from inception for range. The laminar flow wing, developed by North American's chief designer, Edgar Schmood, reduced drag by maintaining smooth airflow over the wing surface at cruising speeds. The wing's internal volume provided space for 170 gallons of fuel, far exceeding typical fighter capacity. Add 2 external drop tanks, each carrying 75 to 110 gallons, and the Mustang could carry enough fuel for missions exceeding 1,600 kilm, including time for combat operations. German aeronautical engineers who examined a captured P-51B that had crash-landed near Hannover in April 1944 found themselves confronting design philosophy that differed fundamentally from Luftwaffe practice. The Mustang was not optimized for any single performance parameter. It wasn't the fastest fighter in level flight. It didn't have the tightest turning radius. Its rate of climb was merely adequate. Its armament of 650 caliber machine guns was effective but not overwhelming, but every design element served operational capability. The bubble canopy introduced on the P-51D model provided 360-degree visibility, crucial for spotting attacks from any angle. The laminar flow wing sacrificed some low-speed maneuverability for high-speed efficiency and extended range. The coolant radiator, mounted under the fuselage behind the pilot, utilized exhaust heat to create a small amount of additional thrust through the Meredith effect, reducing drag while providing efficient cooling. Most significantly, the aircraft was designed for mass production and field maintenance. The Mustang used simple, robust systems wherever possible. The electrical system was straightforward and reliable. The hydraulics operated landing gear, flaps, and gun charging with minimal complexity. The entire power plant could be removed and replaced in under 3 hours at a forward airbase. This design philosophy reflected American industrial culture in ways that German engineers found simultaneously admirable and disturbing. Where Luftwaffe fighters like the Messerschmitt Bee Eff 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 pursued maximum performance through engineering sophistication, accepting complexity and maintenance challenges as necessary trade-offs, the Mustang prioritized availability and sustainability. A German fighter might have superior instantaneous performance, but if that fighter spent half its operational life grounded for maintenance, awaiting spare parts that scarce materials and Allied bombing made increasingly unavailable, its theoretical superiority meant nothing. Meanwhile, American factories were delivering fully operational Mustangs at rates German production could not approach. North American Aviation's Inglewood, California plant and Dallas, Texas facility together produced over 15,000 Mustangs between 1942 and 1945. At peak production in early 1945, the combined facilities were delivering approximately 40 Mustangs per day. This production rate exceeded Germany's entire monthly fighter production during the same period. The Packard Motor Company, manufacturing the Rolls-Royce Merlin under license as the V1650, produced approximately 57,000 engines during the war. This represented more than 1/3 of all Merlin engine production worldwide. Packard had taken a hand-built British precision engine and adapted it for American mass production techniques, reducing cost per unit while maintaining performance and reliability. The transformation from British concept to American industrial product revealed fundamental differences in manufacturing philosophy. Rolls-Royce built Merlin engines with traditional craftsmanship, individual components carefully fitted and adjusted by skilled technicians. Packard engineers redesigned thousands of components for interchangeability and automated production, converting measurements from British imperial units to American standard measurements, revising tolerances to work with American production equipment, and creating assembly line processes that allowed less skilled workers to produce engines meeting British performance specifications. German industry, hampered by materials shortages, transportation disruptions from Allied bombing, and dispersed production facilities that prioritized survival over efficiency, could not compete with this industrial-scale output. By 1944, Germany was producing approximately 40,000 aircraft annually across all types, including bombers, transports, reconnaissance aircraft, and fighters. American factories were producing 50,000 aircraft annually just of single types like the B-24 Liberator bomber. The first Mustangs had arrived in Britain in late 1943, equipping the 354th Fighter Group, nicknamed the Pioneers. Their initial long-range escort missions in December proved the aircraft's potential, but it was the March 1944 Berlin raids that demonstrated the Mustangs' war-winning capability. On March 6, known as Black Monday, the 8th Air Force dispatched 660 bombers, escorted by more than 800 fighters, including substantial Mustang forces, to strike Berlin in the largest daylight raid yet attempted against the German capital. The Luftwaffe responded with everything available, committing hundreds of fighters in massive formations attempting to overwhelm the escort and reach the bombers. The resulting battle raged across hundreds of kilm of German airspace as American fighters engaged German interceptors in swirling dogfights, while bomber formations pressed toward their targets through heavy flak. The Americans lost 69 heavy bombers and 11 fighters. German losses exceeded 100 fighters with their irreplaceable experienced pilots. The casualty exchange, devastating as it appeared, masked the strategic reality. America could replace 69 bombers within days from production lines operating at maximum capacity. Crew losses, while tragic, could be replaced by training programs graduating thousands of pilots, bombardiers, and gunners monthly. The Luftwaffe, conversely, had lost experienced fighter pilots who represented years of training investment and could not be replaced at anything approaching the loss rate. More critically, the psychological impact on German fighter pilots was profound. They had suddenly discovered that nowhere in German airspace was safe from American attack. The deep interior of the Reich, previously protected by the simple fact that enemy fighters lacked the range to reach it, was now vulnerable. Every airfield, every factory, every training base was within striking distance of fighters that could escort bombers to any target in Germany and engage German defenders under conditions that increasingly favored the Americans. Major General Adolf Galland, commanding the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, recognized immediately that the strategic situation had become untenable. Galland, one of Germany's most experienced and respected fighter leaders, had seen his forces steadily ground down throughout 1943 and early 1944 by attrition they could not sustain. The appearance of Mustangs in numbers over Berlin represented not an incremental worsening but a qualitative shift in the air war's character. Galland had flown combat missions himself throughout this period, maintaining his edge as a fighter pilot while commanding fighter operations across the Western Front. In May 1944, he personally encountered Mustangs during a flight over central Germany. Flying a Focke-Wulf 190 fitted with additional armor and cannon for attacking bombers, Galland engaged a bomber formation and immediately found himself pursued by 4 Mustangs diving from altitude. The Americans demonstrated tactics refined through months of combat experience. They worked as a coordinated team, one pair engaging while the other climbed to position for follow-up attacks. They used their superior speed to control the engagement geometry, dictating when and where the fight occurred. Galland, among the Luftwaffe's most skilled pilots with more than 100 confirmed victories, barely escaped by using a ruse, firing his guns forward to create smoke, and spent cartridge casings that gave pursuing American pilots the impression of rear-mounted defensive guns. The incident impressed upon Galland how thoroughly American fighters now dominated German airspace. If he, with years of combat experience and intimate knowledge of fighter tactics, could barely escape engagement with Mustangs, what chance did newly trained replacement pilots have? The Luftwaffe's training program, already compromised by fuel shortages and lack of experienced instructors, was sending pilots into combat with perhaps 30 hours of flight time on type. American pilots arrived in theater with several hundred hours of training, including extensive gunnery and tactics instruction. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, nominally commanding the Luftwaffe, responded to the crisis with characteristic bluster and denial. When informed that single-engine American fighters were appearing over Berlin, Göring reportedly insisted it was impossible, that intelligence reports must be mistaken, that the aircraft sighted were likely twin-engine P-38 Lightnings misidentified in the confusion of combat. Galland personally took Göring flying to demonstrate the reality. Over Brandenburg, they encountered a formation of American bombers, escorted by fighters that were definitely not twin-engine P-38s. The aircraft were unmistakably single-engine, unmistakably Mustangs, and unmistakably operating with complete confidence deep over German territory. According to post-war accounts, Goering admitted after this flight that when he saw Mustangs over Berlin, he knew the war was lost. Whether Goering truly made this statement in March 1944 or constructed it retrospectively after Germany's defeat remains uncertain. Goering's character combined grandiose boasting with equally grandiose excuse-making. His famous earlier boast, "If enemy aircraft bomb Berlin, my name is Meyer," had already been proven hollow by years of RAF night bombing and now American daylight raids. But regardless of what Goering actually said or believed, the strategic reality was clear to anyone analyzing the situation objectively. The Mustang, combined with American industrial production capacity and strategic bombing doctrine, had made the defense of German airspace mathematically impossible. The aircraft's technical specifications told the story with brutal clarity. Maximum speed, 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Service ceiling, 41,900 feet. Combat radius with drop tanks, 750 miles. Rate of roll, excellent across all speed ranges. Firepower, 6. Browning 50 caliber machine guns with 1,840 total rounds, providing sustained firepower in combat. Against this, the Luftwaffe fielded the Messerschmitt Bee Eff 109 Gustav and later variants with comparable speed but inferior range, and the Focke-Wulf 190 Able series fighters with excellent low to medium altitude performance but challenged at the heights American bombers operated. Both German fighters were formidable aircraft flown by increasingly inexperienced pilots facing increasingly experienced American opponents, supported by overwhelming numerical superiority. By mid-1944, the 8th Air Force stationed in Britain operated 14 of its 15 fighter groups with Mustangs. The 9th Air Force, supporting tactical operations, fielded additional Mustang groups. The 15th Air Force, operating from Italy, added still more. American commanders could dispatch over 1,000 fighters to escort bomber missions, creating defensive umbrellas that made attacking the bombers suicidal, while simultaneously hunting German fighters wherever they appeared. General James Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force from January 1944, implemented tactics that maximized the Mustangs' advantages. Rather than requiring fighters to maintain close formation with bomber boxes, restricting their maneuverability and initiative, Doolittle authorized fighter sweeps that ranged ahead of the bombers, attacking German airfields, strafing aircraft on the ground, and engaging enemy fighters before they could assemble for attacks on the bomber streams. This offensive employment multiplied the Mustang's impact. German fighters attempting to form up for coordinated attacks on bomber formations found themselves intercepted during assembly, scattering formations and preventing the massed attacks needed to penetrate bomber defensive fire. Fighters that managed to reach attack positions faced Mustangs diving from altitude with speed and energy advantages. Fighters that survived combat and returned to base often found their airfields under attack by strafing Mustangs, hitting parked aircraft, fuel trucks, and ground facilities. The Mustang groups targeting Luftwaffe training bases proved particularly devastating. Germany's pilot training program, already compromised by fuel shortages that limited flight time, relied on bases deep in interior Germany, where student pilots could practice without interference. Mustangs ranging across Germany began hitting these bases systematically, destroying training aircraft on the ground, and sometimes catching students practicing maneuvers in obsolete biplane trainers that had no chance of escape. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe was catastrophic. Fighter pilots who had previously enjoyed local air superiority within Germany itself, able to engage bombers without worrying about fighter opposition during assembly and approach phases, now faced American fighters from takeoff to landing. Every sortie became desperate survival against opponents who held every advantage except familiarity with local terrain. German prisoners of war interrogated by American intelligence officers in summer and fall, 1944 consistently cited American fighter superiority, particularly Mustangs, as the decisive factor in Germany's loss of air superiority. The testimony was remarkably consistent across all ranks and experience levels. A captured Oberleutnant from Jagdgeschwader 3, one of the Luftwaffe's premier fighter wings, provided detailed analysis during interrogation at a facility designated P.O. Box 1142 in Fort Hunt, Virginia. The interrogation transcripts, declassified decades later, revealed profound understanding of how completely the strategic situation had shifted. The American fighters, particularly the P-51, possess operational advantages we cannot counter with tactics or skill alone, the German officer stated. Their range allows them to escort bombers to any target in the Reich. Their high-altitude performance exceeds our own. Their production numbers make attrition sustainable for them while it destroys us. Most critically, they are backed by industrial capacity and resources we cannot match. The officer detailed specific tactical scenarios that illustrated Luftwaffe disadvantages. When German fighters attacked bomber formations, American escorts dove from altitude with speed advantage. If German fighters attempted to climb to advantage height before engaging, they burned excessive fuel, reducing their combat time, and often found Americans already positioned above them. If German fighters tried to avoid combat, American fighters pursued, catching German aircraft during landing approaches when they were most vulnerable. Every tactical option led to unfavorable engagement conditions. The only winning move was not to engage at all. But failing to engage meant allowing American bombers to strike their targets with impunity, destroying the industrial base that produced the fighters and fuel needed to continue resistance. It was a strategic checkmate concealed behind the ongoing operations that made Germany's eventual defeat merely a matter of time rather than speculation. The captured P-51, examined by German technicians at Göttingen, revealed construction quality that shocked inspectors. The airframe showed precise manufacturing with excellent fit and finish. All fasteners, rivets, and structural connections were cleanly executed. The electrical system used color-coded wiring with clear labeling. The instrument panel was logically arranged for pilot operation. Everything spoke of quality control and attention to detail across thousands of production units. This contrasted sharply with late-war German fighters emerging from dispersed, bomb-damaged production facilities. Quality control had deteriorated as factories prioritized quantity over quality. Components arrived from subcontractors with fitment problems requiring field adjustments. Electrical systems used whatever wire was available, forcing mechanics to trace circuits by trial and error. Instruments and equipment varied between aircraft depending on availability. The difference was particularly evident in the engines. The Packard-built Merlin, examined by German technicians, showed consistent, high-quality machining and assembly. Tolerances were tight, but not excessive. All components fit together as designed without need for custom fitting. The engine started reliably, ran smoothly, and delivered rated power without issues. German engines, by late 1944, increasingly exhibited problems from inadequate materials and rushed production. Pistons made with inferior alloys wore rapidly. Valve guides loosened. Oil seals failed. Engines that should have provided hundreds of hours of operation were failing after tens of hours in service. This forced frequent replacements, consuming mechanics' time and scarce spare parts while keeping aircraft grounded. The maintenance manual captured with one Mustang revealed another American advantage. The English-language text was clear, detailed, and well illustrated. Troubleshooting procedures walked mechanics through systematic diagnosis. Parts diagrams showed every component with clear numbering. Maintenance schedules specified exactly what needed inspection or replacement at each interval. German maintenance documentation, by contrast, assumed extensive prior knowledge. Technical manuals focused on theory rather than practical procedures. Troubleshooting guidance was minimal. Mechanics relied heavily on experience and institutional knowledge, which became problematic as experienced personnel were killed, wounded, or transferred and replaced with hastily trained novices. This entire system, from design philosophy through production quality to maintenance support, revealed how thoroughly American industrial methods surpassed German capability in producing complex equipment at scale. The Germans could design excellent aircraft. The Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter represented revolutionary technology that surpassed anything the Allies fielded. But Germany could not produce enough 262s to matter strategically, could not train enough pilots to fly them effectively, could not provide adequate ground support to keep them operational. America's advantage was not technological genius producing miracle weapons. It was systematic, methodical industrial organization producing very good weapons in overwhelming quantities, with full logistical support. The Mustang epitomized this approach. It was not the fastest fighter, nor the most maneuverable, nor the most heavily armed, but it was fast enough, maneuverable enough, and well-armed enough, while being available in numbers that made it strategically decisive. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The transformation in American bomber crew morale following the Mustang's arrival was dramatic and well documented. Before March 1944, bomber crews faced the psychological burden of knowing that once their fighter escorts turned back at the limit of their range, they would be alone against German interceptors for hours during the deepest portions of their missions. The period between escort departure and their return on the way home, sometimes lasting 2 to 3 hours, represented the most dangerous phase of every mission. Bomber crews developed grim, informal statistics tracking survival probability. A crew's odds of completing a 25-mission tour, the requirement for rotation home, hovered around 25% through late 1943. Casualty rates on certain deep penetration missions exceeded 10% of aircraft dispatched. The second Schweinfurt raid on October 14, 1943 saw 60 bombers shot down out of 291 dispatched, a 20% loss rate that was unsustainable. These losses had forced the 8th Air Force to suspend deep penetration raids into Germany in autumn 1943. The strategic bombing campaign, central to Allied strategy for defeating Germany, had effectively stalled because unescorted bombers could not survive against determined German fighter opposition. All the industrial capacity pouring out thousands of heavy bombers meant nothing if those bombers could not reach their targets and return. The Mustang solved this problem directly and immediately. By early summer 1944, with substantial Mustang forces operational, bomber loss rates had fallen dramatically. Missions that would have cost 50 to 70 bombers in late 1943 were now losing 10 to 15. The presence of long-range fighter escorts fundamentally altered the calculation of risk versus strategic gain. Bomber crews, who had previously faced each mission with grim resignation to probable death or captivity, began believing they might actually survive their tours. This psychological shift affected everything from crew cohesion to willingness to press attacks through heavy flak. Men who believed they might survive flew with greater aggression and determination than those who had already written their own obituaries. The letters home from American bomber crews in spring and summer 1944 reflected this transformation. Where earlier correspondence had carried undertones of fatalism and carefully worded final sentiments, later letters discussed post-war plans, relationships awaiting their return, and confidence in ultimate victory. The presence of Mustang escorts, visible throughout missions as silver guardians weaving patterns above and around the bomber formations, provided tangible assurance that someone was protecting them. German fighter pilots experienced the inverse psychological trajectory. Where they had previously enjoyed local superiority during portions of each mission, they now faced American fighters throughout every engagement. The sense of invincibility that came from attacking bombers in formations with vulnerable approaches had evaporated, replaced by constant defensive vigilance and growing awareness that survival was becoming more luck than skill. Hauptmann Walter Wolfram, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot who survived the war and later provided extensive interviews about his combat experience, described the transformation in stark terms. In 1942 and early 1943, we hunted bombers with confidence that we held tactical advantage, Wolfram recalled in post-war testimony. By summer 1944, we were being hunted. Every mission became survival exercise. The Americans held all advantages. Speed, altitude, numbers, fuel endurance. We could engage only when they permitted engagement on their terms. Wolfram had opportunity to fly captured P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs as part of the Circus Rosarius program, where captured Allied aircraft were evaluated and demonstrated to Luftwaffe pilots to familiarize them with enemy capabilities. His assessment of the Mustang was professional and grudging in its respect. The Mustang is disconcerting aircraft to confront, Wolfram stated. It possesses no single overwhelming advantage but combines good performance in all critical parameters. Against Bf-109, it is slightly faster above 6,000 meters, comparable in turn radius, superior in roll rate, and vastly superior in operational radius. Against 190, similar story with different details. The aircraft can be defeated by skilled pilot with tactical advantage, but obtaining tactical advantage requires the American pilot to make errors. They rarely do. The phrase disconcerting aircraft captured precisely how German pilots viewed the Mustang. It was not terrifying in the manner of an overwhelmingly superior opponent. It was concerning because it was professionally competent in every aspect, backed by industrial production that made individual defeats strategically meaningless. Shoot down a Mustang, and 3 more appeared tomorrow. Meanwhile, every German fighter lost represented irreplaceable material and pilot training investment. The mathematics of attrition warfare favored the side that could sustain losses indefinitely while maintaining operational strength. America could. Germany could not. By June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Luftwaffe had been so thoroughly defeated over Western Europe that German aircraft were nearly absent from the invasion beaches. Of the 14,000 Allied aircraft supporting Operation Overlord, virtually none faced German air opposition. The Luftwaffe had not been completely destroyed. Substantial fighter forces remained operational in Germany, but those forces had been rendered strategically ineffective through constant attrition, fuel shortages, and the psychological impact of prolonged defeats against superior Allied forces. The Mustang had not accomplished this alone. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-38 Lightning, the British Supermarine Spitfire, and the Hawker Typhoon all contributed to Allied air superiority. But the Mustang's combination of high-altitude performance and long range made it uniquely capable of escorting bombers throughout their missions while engaging German fighters anywhere over Western Europe. The strategic bombing campaign that the Mustang enabled destroyed German industrial capacity systematically through 1944 and into 1945. Oil refineries, aircraft factories, transportation networks, and communications facilities were hit repeatedly, with increasing accuracy as bomber crews gained experience and Allied air superiority allowed them to approach targets without intensive fighter harassment. German aircraft production actually increased through 1944, despite intensifying bombing. Dispersed production facilities, underground factories, and ruthless prioritization of aircraft manufacturing over consumer goods allowed Germany to produce over 40,000 aircraft in 1944, more than any previous war year. But these aircraft increasingly lacked fuel to fly them, trained pilots to operate them, and spare parts to maintain them. The destruction of German oil production proved particularly devastating. Synthetic fuel plants, which provided the majority of Luftwaffe aviation gasoline, were hit repeatedly by American heavy bombers escorted by Mustangs. The plants were large, difficult to defend, and critical to operations. By autumn 1944, fuel shortages had reduced Luftwaffe training to minimal levels. Student pilots received perhaps 20 to 30 hours of flight training before assignment to operational units, compared to the 200 to 300 hours American pilots received. This training disparity compounded the Mustang's technical advantages. An inexperienced pilot in an excellent aircraft will lose to an experienced pilot in a good aircraft. German fighter units were increasingly filled with inexperienced pilots flying adequate aircraft against experienced American pilots flying excellent aircraft. The outcome was predetermined. The destruction of German transportation networks further degraded Luftwaffe effectiveness. Moving aircraft, pilots, fuel, ammunition, and spare parts required functional rail networks and roadways. Allied bombing, particularly the concentrated attacks on marshalling yards and bridges, made movement increasingly difficult. Aircraft sat idle, awaiting fuel that sat in tank cars on damaged rail lines. Spare parts languished in warehouses that could not be reached. Pilots waited at assembly points because damaged transportation prevented their movement to operational bases. The cumulative effect was collapse of operational effectiveness despite substantial remaining forces. On paper, Germany fielded thousands of fighters in early 1945. In practice, fewer than 1/4 of these aircraft could sortie on any given day due to fuel shortages, maintenance backlog, and logistics failures. The introduction of the Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter in autumn 1944 represented Germany's last hope for regaining air superiority through technological advantage. The 262 was revolutionary aircraft with performance that exceeded any Allied piston-engine fighter. Maximum speed approached 540 miles per hour, service ceiling exceeded 38,000 feet, armament of 4 30mm cannon could destroy a heavy bomber with a single burst. Against unescorted bombers, the 262 was devastating. Its speed made interception by conventional fighters nearly impossible. Pilots who mastered its handling characteristics could attack bomber formations with near impunity, shooting down multiple aircraft before fuel exhaustion forced return to base. But the 262 arrived too late, and in too few numbers to affect the war's outcome. Production problems, materials shortages, and Allied bombing of manufacturing facilities limited output to approximately 1,400 aircraft by war's end. Of these, only a fraction were operationally ready at any time. The jet engines required rare materials and precise manufacturing that Germany's compromised industrial base struggled to provide. Engine life was measured in tens of hours before requiring replacement. Pilot training on the 262 was minimal. The aircraft handled very differently from piston-engine fighters, requiring substantial flight time to master. But fuel shortages meant pilots often received only a few familiarization flights before being thrust into combat. The results were predictable. Many 262s were lost to operational accidents during takeoff and landing, when the aircraft was most vulnerable and pilots' inexperience most likely to prove fatal. Adolf Galland, who had been effectively removed from commanding the Luftwaffe fighter arm after repeated conflicts with Göring over strategy and resource allocation, had returned to combat duty in early 1945, commanding Jagdverband 44, an elite 262-equipped unit. The unit's experienced pilots, many of them Knight's Cross holders, with hundreds of combat missions, demonstrated what the 262 could accomplish when properly employed. Operating from Munich-Riem, Jagdverband 44 attacked American bomber formations through March and April 1945, shooting down dozens of heavy bombers. But even this elite unit could not reverse the strategic situation. They represented perhaps 50 operational jets against thousands of Allied aircraft. Every sortie risked encounters with Mustang formations that, while unable to match the 262's speed in level flight, could intercept the jets during takeoff and landing when they were slow and vulnerable. American fighter pilots developed tactics specifically for engaging 262s. Mustang groups would orbit near known jet bases, waiting for the jets to land with low fuel after combat sorties. The jets, committed to landing approach with no fuel for evasive maneuvers, became easy targets for patient Mustang pilots. Numerous 262s were shot down in the traffic pattern by fighters that could never have caught them in open flight. The 262 thus represented the futility of Germany's late-war situation. They possessed revolutionary technology but lacked the industrial capacity, resources, training infrastructure, and strategic depth to deploy that technology at scale. Meanwhile, America fielded good enough technology in quantities that rendered German advantages meaningless. This pattern repeated across all aspects of the air war. German fighters might have superior instantaneous performance. German pilots might demonstrate incredible skill and courage. German tactics might be innovative and professionally executed, but American industrial production, strategic planning, and willingness to accept casualties while grinding forward to victory overwhelmed every German advantage through sheer scale and sustainability. The Mustangs' role in this victory extended beyond direct combat effectiveness. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. For Americans, the Mustang represented confidence that they possessed the tools needed for victory. For Germans, it represented the futility of continued resistance against an opponent whose resources seemed infinite. German prisoners of war interviewed after the war consistently cited air superiority as the decisive factor in Germany's defeat. Even soldiers who had faced Soviet armies in the East acknowledged that Allied control of the air made operations increasingly impossible. Tactical movement required night darkness to avoid air attack. Armored formations were bombed and strafed continuously. Supply convoys were destroyed on roads. Command posts were hit by fighter bombers with growing accuracy. The Mustang enabled this dominance. By destroying the Luftwaffe's capacity for effective resistance, it allowed Allied air power to range freely across German-occupied territory, attacking targets from front-line positions to deep rear areas. The strategic bombing campaign that devastated German industry relied on Mustang escorts. The tactical air support that paralyzed German ground operations flew with impunity because Mustangs had swept German fighters from the sky. The production statistics told the story with brutal clarity. North American aviation delivered over 15,000 Mustangs between 1942 and 1945. Approximately 13,300 were Merlin-powered variants, the P-51, B, C, and D models that proved decisive. At peak production in early 1945, the factories were delivering more Mustangs per week than Germany produced fighters per month. This production occurred while America simultaneously manufactured tens of thousands of other aircraft types, built the world's largest navy, produced hundreds of thousands of vehicles and artillery pieces, supplied Allied forces worldwide with equipment and supplies, and maintained a civilian economy that, while rationed, still provided a quality of life incomprehensible to Germans living under total war mobilization and Allied bombing. The Packard Motor Company's production of Merlin engines demonstrated similar industrial dominance. 57,000 engines produced represented organized, systematic application of manufacturing capability that Germany simply could not match. Every engine met specifications. Every engine could be installed in any Mustang airframe without custom fitting. Every engine was supported by supply chains that ensured spare parts availability anywhere American forces operated. This logistics tail, invisible but essential, made American dominance sustainable. German fighters might sortie from bases that lacked spare propellers, replacement guns, or sufficient ammunition. Luftwaffe pilots often flew with partial fuel loads because supplies were insufficient for full tanks. Ground crews performed repairs with improvised parts because proper replacements were unavailable. American forces faced no such constraints. Supply ships crossed the Atlantic continuously despite U-boat threats. Supply dumps in England held months of reserves. Damaged aircraft were repaired with proper parts or scrapped and replaced with new aircraft from the production pipeline. Pilots who completed tours rotated home and were replaced by fresh pilots from training programs that graduated thousands monthly. The systematic application of overwhelming resources to a single strategic objective, defeating the Luftwaffe and gaining air superiority, represented American industrial warfare at its peak effectiveness. The Mustang was the instrument through which this strategy manifested in combat operations. Every Mustang sortie represented not just that individual aircraft and pilot, but the entire industrial system supporting them. German commanders understood this by summer 1944. Intelligence assessments detailed American production capacity with depressing accuracy. German industry, even at maximum output with slave labor and total prioritization of military production, could not approach American numbers. The disparity was not 2-to-1 or even 5-to-1. In most categories, American production exceeded German output by factors of 10 or more. This realization permeated German military thinking through the final year of the war. Officers who had previously fought with conviction that German superiority in tactics and technology would overcome Allied numerical advantages faced evidence that no tactical brilliance could offset strategic disadvantage of this magnitude. Courage meant nothing when the enemy could accept 10-to-1 casualty ratios and still advance. Skill became irrelevant when outnumbered 50-to-1. The Mustang, visible in the sky over every German city and military installation by late 1944, symbolized this overwhelming power. Its presence said more clearly than any propaganda that Germany faced an opponent who could produce sophisticated, high-performance weapons in unlimited quantities, while simultaneously building everything else needed to prosecute industrialized warfare on global scale. The end came in stages through the final months of the war. Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's last major offensive action on January 1, 1945, expended fighters and pilots in a surprise attack on Allied airfields that achieved tactical success but strategic futility. Hundreds of Allied aircraft were destroyed on the ground, but the Luftwaffe lost approximately 300 aircraft and 200 pilots, many of them experienced leaders and instructors whose deaths could not be replaced. The attack demonstrated Germany's continued capacity for military operations, but it also demonstrated that even successful operations could not change the strategic calculus. Allied aircraft losses were replaced within days. German losses were irreplaceable. The attack burned precious fuel reserves that could not be replenished. It sacrificed pilots whose experience was desperately needed for training replacement forces. By March 1945, organized Luftwaffe resistance had effectively ceased over Western Europe. Individual fighters still sortied, Tu-62 jets still attacked bombers, flak still defended targets. But the Luftwaffe, as a coherent fighting force capable of contesting air superiority, no longer existed. The last Mustang combat missions over Europe occurred in early May 1945 as German forces surrendered. American fighter groups transitioned from combat operations to patrol duties, enforcing surrender terms and preventing last-ditch resistance by fanatics who refused to accept defeat. The Mustangs' war continued briefly in the Pacific Theater, where P-51Ds flew from Iwo Jima, escorting Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers, attacking Japan. But the Japanese surrender in August 1945 ended the Mustang's combat career in the role it was designed for, long-range bomber escort. The aircraft continued serving in the U.S. Air Force through the Korean War, flying ground attack missions with distinction despite being obsolete compared to jet fighters then entering service. The last operational Mustangs in U.S. military service flew reconnaissance missions over Vietnam in 1967, more than 20 years after the war they were designed to fight. But the Mustang's historical significance transcends its technical specifications or combat record. The aircraft represented the moment when American industrial power, fully mobilized for war, demonstrated conclusively that victory in modern warfare required not just battlefield courage or tactical skill, but systematic application of industrial capacity and resources at scale, impossible for any European power to match. German engineers who examined captured Mustangs understood this with painful clarity. They were not examining merely an aircraft. They were examining evidence of industrial philosophy and manufacturing capability that exceeded anything Germany could achieve even in peacetime, let alone under wartime conditions of materials shortages, labor disruptions, and constant bombing. The technical assessment reports, captured by Allied forces after Germany's surrender and analyzed by American intelligence, revealed the depth of German understanding. One report, prepared by engineers at the Göttingen Evaluation Center after examining a P-51D, concluded with observations that transcended technical analysis. This aircraft represents not merely incremental improvement over existing fighters, but fundamental advantage in industrial production capacity and design philosophy. The report stated, "The Americans have created weapons system that prioritizes operational effectiveness over peak performance, reliability over complexity, and maintainability over sophistication. Most critically, they have designed for mass production and fielded the aircraft in numbers that render individual technical superiority meaningless. The Americans can accept aircraft that is merely excellent in all parameters rather than supreme in any single parameter. They compensate for any performance deficiency through overwhelming numbers and superior logistics. This approach, while philosophically distasteful to German engineering tradition, proves strategically superior under conditions of total war." Report continued with detailed analysis of specific design elements that exemplified this philosophy. The bubble canopy that sacrificed some structural strength for visibility, the laminar flow wing that accepted some low-speed handling challenges for high-speed efficiency, the Merlin engine installation that prioritized easy removal and replacement over minimizing drag. Every design choice served operational effectiveness and sustainable deployment. The Mustang could be maintained in the field by mechanics with moderate training. It could be operated from rough forward airstrips. It could be repaired with standard tools and readily available parts. It was, in every sense, a production weapon designed to be manufactured by the thousands and operated by an industrial air force. German fighters, by contrast, increasingly represented engineering excellence undermined by production difficulties. The Messerschmitt Bee Eff 109 K4, the ultimate production variant entering service in late 1944, offered performance competitive with the Mustang, but it arrived too late, in too few numbers, to affect outcomes, and even those aircraft that were produced often sat grounded for lack of fuel or spare parts. The Mustang thus achieved strategic victory not through overwhelming technical superiority, but through adequate technical competence backed by industrial production and logistics that could not be matched. It was the right aircraft at the right time, fielded by a nation whose industrial capacity could translate design into thousands of operational aircraft supported by global supply chains. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The legacy endured long after the last combat mission. The Mustang became, in popular memory and historical analysis, the symbol of Allied air power in World War II. It represented the moment when German fighter pilots, looking up at silver American fighters weaving patterns above Berlin, understood that the mathematical certainty they had relied upon, the physical impossibility of long-range single-engine fighter escorts, had been overcome by enemy innovation, production capacity, and strategic vision. That moment, repeated in countless individual encounters across the skies of Europe through 1944 and 1945, marked not just tactical defeat, but psychological transformation. German pilots transitioned from hunters to hunted, from confident warriors to desperate survivors, from believers in inevitable victory to men who understood they fought only to delay the inevitable. The Mustang had not won the war alone. No single weapon system does, but it had broken the strategic stalemate over German airspace, enabled the strategic bombing campaign that crippled German industry, and established air superiority that allowed Allied ground forces to operate without fear of air attack. In doing so, it shortened the war and saved countless lives on both sides by making Germany's eventual defeat both obvious and inevitable. The copper-colored aircraft with the distinctive profile, the long nose housing the Merlin engine, the laminar flow wings, the bubble canopy, became the physical manifestation of American industrial power applied to warfare. When German soldiers saw Mustangs overhead, they saw not just enemy aircraft, but evidence of the vast industrial machine that produced them, supported them, and fielded them in numbers that made resistance futile. That psychological impact, the crushing weight of knowing you fought an enemy with essentially unlimited resources, proved as devastating as the physical destruction the aircraft inflicted. The Mustang destroyed not just aircraft and pilots, but hope, confidence, and the conviction that German technical superiority could overcome Allied material advantages. In the end, the story of the Mustang over Berlin is not really about aircraft performance or technical specifications. It is about the moment when one side's technological innovation and industrial capacity so thoroughly overwhelmed the other that continued resistance became obviously pointless. It is about the psychological shift from confident belief in victory to resigned acknowledgement of inevitable defeat. That morning in March 1944, when Oberleutnant Kurt Bonger first saw silver American fighters weaving above the bomber stream 600 kilm from their bases in England, he witnessed the future, a future where German airspace offered no sanctuary, where American bombers could strike any target at will, where the Luftwaffe's capacity for effective resistance would be ground away by attrition until nothing remained but scattered remnants of what had once been the world's most feared air force. The war would continue for 14 more months, hundreds of thousands would die, cities would be destroyed. But the outcome, visible to anyone who understood the implications of long-range fighter escorts over Berlin, was no longer in doubt. The Mustang had arrived, and with its arrival, Germany had lost control of its own airspace, lost the capacity to defend its cities and industries, lost the psychological advantage of fighting behind defensive barriers that Allied forces could not penetrate. The mathematical certainty that had protected Germany's interior was shattered, and with it, any realistic hope for German victory evaporated into the thin air at 28,000 feet above Brandenburg, where silver American fighters weaved their patterns, masters of the sky, arbiters of Germany's fate. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.